Although Flensburg was a naval base, it was not bombed. On the 9th of July 1941, my stepfather, who had been nursed devotedly by my mother for years, died of intestinal cancer. It was weeks before the news reached me in Russia. My younger brother, a keen whaler, had been called up into the Navy and was sailing about in his minesweeper, a converted whaling vessel, somewhere off the coast of Norway. Only my sister, Annalisa, was still at home to give my mother a hand. At the end of 1942, she was conscripted to Holland and posted to the staff of the military commander of Holland. Our 7-room apartment was considered too big, and several rooms were requisitioned for refugees. My mother was very brave and concealed her anxieties about her children. She was so pleased to see me again, and with the real coffee I had brought, besides a few tons of army food. The pleasant days in the company of my mother came to an end. I then went back to Berlin to collect my Mercedes. With movement orders, the tank full of gas, and some of my stock of coffee in my baggage, I set off. Like Berlin before, Paris, too, now proved a disappointment. Supplies had become more difficult. The city was swarming with administrative personnel. The Gestapo, too, had already spread its net over France. At HQ, I was at once given a room in one of the many requisitioned luxury hotels on the Champs-Élysées. J.B. Morel and Clement Duour were very delighted to see me again. From British and underground sources, they knew our situation on the Eastern Front better than I did, and gave us no great chance of winning the war. All the same, I spent some happy hours in Clémence-Bar-le-Chevalier. I went there only in civilian clothes. One met no Germans there. I paid a visit also to Le Vésinet, where we had been stationed after the French campaign in 1940. I left Paris somewhat earlier than planned. I no longer felt so at home there as before. What had the war done to the city? C'est la guerre. The French had come to terms with it, and were already reckoning with the fact that we would lose the war. At the replacement section, I found that Beck had already returned. For him, too, there had been nothing to keep him at home for very long. It was now the middle of March 1942. The severe winter was over, and we thought we had become sufficiently acclimatized to 90 to Africa. Beck and I went to the Army Clothing Depot to collect our tropical equipment. What we were fitted out with there defies description. One could see that Germany had no longer any colonies since 1918, and so had no idea of what was suitable for the tropics. We need only have asked our allies, the Italians, but no, the commissariat had designed the tropical equipment strictly in the Prussian mode, khaki-coloured, tight-fitting uniform of close material, with a linen belt and high lace-up boots. In addition, a pith helmet, which according to long-standing opinion, was essential wear in the tropics. Along with the other pieces, shirts impermeable to air, a brown tie, etc., we acknowledged receipt of our equipment and returned to the barracks to stage a fashion show. Wounded men from North Africa, waiting there for Ting, told us how they, like many others, had carried on a lively trade with the Italians in order to exchange at least some of their equipment for the more appropriate Italian uniforms. They told us also of the first actions in the desert, of Rommel's rapid advance, by which he had surprised the British, and of the conditions of desert warfare, such as the heat, the sandstorms, and the cold nights. Finally, it was time to go. We were given our movement orders, and on April 1942, we boarded the Berlin-Rome express coach with a sleeping compartment of our own. To the clatter of the wheels, we both thought back to our return from Russia in snow and ice. How quickly things changed. A night in Rome, which seemed quite unaware of the war. From the German liaison officer, we learned that we were to go on to Brindisi by rail, and from there, fly in a supply plane via Crete to Dima, which lay EQ Cyrenaica. What would await us? We were highly expectant, almost eager for adventure. From Brindisi, we flew to Crete, the island on which our paratroops had descended the year before, among them Max Schmeling, the idol of German boxing. We relished the warmth of spring. Then, on the morning of the 8th of April 1942, we took off for North Africa in our Junkers 52, known affectionately as Auntie G. I was allowed to sit in the cockpit. We have to fly low over the sea, the pilot told me. In spite of our air superiority, there are always a few Spitfires or Hurricanes buzzing about the Mediterranean. They come from Malta, which for some reason, quite beyond me, has not been attacked and occupied by now. At that moment, I was not thinking of the war, or of what might lie in store for me. I was too taken up with the idea of getting to know a new continent. Suddenly the machine was pulled higher. "We were lucky," laughed the pilot. "We shall soon be landing in Dema." The outlines of Africa emerged before us, the narrow coastal strip cultivated by the Italians, with its date palms, olive groves, the whitewashed houses of the colonists, and the long asphalt ribbon of the Via Balbia. Behind it shimmered the desert. "That is the Stony Desert," the pilot informed me, "about 200 to 300 kilometers deep, before the start of the Sahara proper, with its huge white dunes. These level plains, broken frequently by rocks and hills of gravel, have been the scene of the fighting for the past year or so." I had read books about the desert and the Bedouins, those nomadic people who, for more than 2,500 years, had wandered across the deserts of Arabia and Libya, living according to their own laws and with no form of state. Already, I thought I could feel something of the longing that is said to strike all who once set foot in the desert. I hoped I would find time to savor this new environment and its people. Leaving a huge cloud of dust behind her, Auntie Ju landed gently on the sandy runway. The midday heat took us aback even at that time of year. What a contrast to the icy snowstorms of Russia. "I am Lance Corporal Manthe," a man in a faded uniform introduced himself. "Major von Luck, I presume." His pure Berlin accent was music in my ears and took me back to my years in Potsdam. "I have come to pick you up. They were expecting you." Beck and I felt like greenhorns in our new brown tropical outfits. We stowed our gear. "Thanks for collecting us, Manthe. But what do we want with our thick coats in this heat? You will need them all right. It is bloody cold at night. I will get you something Italian as uniform. They know what is practical to do in here." The windshield of the Jeep was folded flat and covered over to prevent reflections from the sun. "I am to take you to Rommel first, before we go to division and our battalion." Everyone there spoke only of Rommel, not of the general. So popular was he with his men, he was one of them. During the journey, Manthe told us of the battles of the past year, as he had experienced them. He spoke of the father of the reconnaissance battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Freiherr von Weckmar, his popularity, his successes, and of how proud von Weckmar was to have been the first to land on African soil in 1941. "Our battalion is the apple of Rommel's eye," he added proudly. It occurred to me that I was not going to find things easy. We left Dima in an easterly direction. Rommel's HQ must lie somewhere among the olive groves. One of us must look out for aircraft. They usually come from behind. Beck took this on. Suddenly we turned off the road. No path, no track was to be seen. Tire marks were always removed at once as camouflage. Suddenly we stopped. Rommel's HQ. All the vehicles were well dispersed and camouflaged. In the middle stood a monster of a truck. That is the Mammoth. We took it from the British and converted it into Rommel's command car. I spotted some 8-wheeled scout cars. This was the new fast reconnaissance vehicle, which we had not had yet in Russia. I was rather keyed up. After all, I had not seen Rommel since the French campaign in 1940. An orderly officer took me to him. He had a deep suntan covering his sharp features, giving him a fully healthy look. He was at the peak of his career, clearly enjoying his worldwide reputation. He was in a high mood and clearly glad to see me. "I am reporting on transfer to the Africa Corps, Colonel General," I said. "Glad you were here," he replied. "I have waited long enough. Unfortunately, I have had to send Weckmar to Germany. He became sick. You are taking over my pet battalion. Let it be a credit to you." Then typically, he came straight to the point. "You have come at just the right moment. I am preparing a new offensive to forestall the British. Your battalion will play an important part in it. My Chief of Staff, Gauss, will brief you. Then report to your division. How is my old 7th Panzer Division? Was it bad in Russia?" I gave him a brief account and was dismissed. It was the start of a new phase. General Gauss, Rommel's Chief of Staff, with whom I would have much to do, gave me a summary of the situation. He then added, "Rommel is very disappointed at the indifference of the upper leadership. Hitler and the High Command see North Africa as a secondary theatre of war. For the British, however, it is decisive. In addition, he is exasperated by the slack conduct of the sea war by the Italians. In March, for instance, instead of the requested 60,000 tons of material, only 18,000 arrived. In Rommel's view, the chance of victory in Africa had already been missed. Despite heavy losses through our U-boat campaign, and despite a 12,000-mile-long sea route, sufficient supplies for the British were getting through to the front. That did not sound very encouraging. Nevertheless, Rommel seemed to be set on turning the tables once again in his favour. He hoped to take Tobruk by an unexpected thrust and be able to advance far into Egypt, provided he could forestall the British. I took my leave. "Manthe, we have got to go to division now." It was the 21st Panzer Division, and then on to the battalion. "Very well, Major. You seem to be well in with Rommel for him to greet you personally," said Manthe. I told him a few things about Rommel. "Well, yes," he said. "It certainly is unusual to bring someone here from Russia. Our commander von Weckmar was a great guy. His son Rudiger has also been with us now for a couple of weeks, as a young lieutenant. That is tradition. You will be all right." Major Divisional HQ was well camouflaged under palms and olive trees. General von Bismarck greeted me in friendly fashion. He had been my commander in East Prussia in 1930, at the start of my military career. Like so many who were serving in the desert, he looked emaciated. The pitiless heat by day, the icy cold at night, the sandstorms, the millions of flies, and the hard battles had left their mark. "A hearty welcome to you, Luck. We have not seen each other for 12 years. You are entering upon a fine inheritance. Weckmar and his battalion have done great things and are Rommel's favourite unit. After your service in Russia, you have got some adapting to do. Familiarise yourself with conditions as quickly as you can. We shall probably be opening a decisive offensive before long. Best of luck." The General Staff Officer briefed me on the situation. The task of the 3rd Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion was to reconnoitre in the far south, prevent or report any outflanking move by the enemy, and form the spearhead in any attack. "The British, meanwhile, have strongly fortified their Gazala position," he continued. "There is a vast minefield with about 500,000 mines stretching from the coast to Bir Hachim, a waterhole south of Tobruk, originally developed by the Italians. Bir Hachim is held by French troops under General Koenig. Behind this defensive barrier, the British are preparing to go on the offensive as soon as they can bring up enough material. And that, apparently, is what Rommel means to forestall. So we have got to be extremely vigilant to ensure that the British do not attack around the south of Bir Hachim deep in our flank. To look out for that, and to prevent it is your job, Luck, among other things. We left the green of Cyrenaica for the south. Manthe knew the track. Normally one travelled in the desert only by compass, the most important instrument carried by everyone. Behind us, we raised a huge cloud of dust, which engulfed us whenever we had to brake abruptly. The desert shimmered. In the far distance, it was often hard to tell whether the shimmering something was a vehicle or merely a camel's thorn bush. Suddenly, visible only a few meters in advance, we came to a wadi, one of the many dried-up watercourses in which my new battalion was lying, well dispersed. Captain Everth, who had been leading the battalion, and a few other officers were there to greet me, correctly, but with a certain reserve, as it seemed to me. Von Weckmar, the old man, would be hard to replace. We went to the command car, a converted Opel Blitz truck. As Everth explained to me, all vehicles were fitted with special oil filters against the dust. Many of the trucks had treadless tyres, so that they left no distinctive track in the sand. Besides the new 8-wheeled scout cars, I spotted some tracked motorcycles, 750cc BMWs, fitted with 2 narrow tracks in place of the rear tyres. They had been developed especially for the desert. I asked all the officers to gather together so that I could meet them. Once again, I felt out of place in my new tropical outfit, for all the other officers wore faded uniforms, of which they were very proud, or loose Italian trousers and shirts. Good old Manthe organised something similar for me too, in the next few days. "I know your battalion from pre-war days, when I was in Potsdam," I began. There was a healthy rivalry between our 2 battalions, as to which was the better or the more prominent. But we also took part together in a number of rallies. It is an honour for me to succeed your beloved and seasoned Commander von Weckmar. I have only my experience from the French campaign, and from Russia. I have much to learn here, and would be grateful for any help you can give me. I should like to go out on reconnaissance with one of your patrols as soon as possible, to familiarise myself with conditions. I greeted each of the men individually with a handshake. The ice appeared to have been broken. I learned that on the British side, we were usually up against the Royal Dragoons, the Hussars, and the dreaded long-range desert group, led by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling. The British used the better armoured but slower Humber scout car, we the faster, nimbler eight-wheeler. Meanwhile, we understood each other. The prevailing atmosphere was one of respect and fair play. I got used to the Fata Morgana, the mirage, which looked so hopefully like a lake, but which on approach dissolved into nothing. I had also to get accustomed to the ferocious sandstorm which the Italians called the ghibli. It usually lasted for a day, but sometimes for 3. One could see it coming. The sky grew dark. The fine sand penetrated every pore and made any movement, let alone any military operation, impossible. I learned to travel by compass, and at the onset of darkness, to find my way back to the battalion with mutual light signals. The reconnaissance trips into the desert held a great fascination for me. In the weeks that followed, things remained fairly quiet. Individual British patrols put out feelers to the south, but they were intercepted by our own wide-ranging patrols. In this, our fast eight-wheelers were particularly valuable. By the beginning of May 1942, I felt myself integrated. I had visited and gotten to know all the companies and had been out with several patrols. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of daily life. We used to drink half a litre of fluids in the morning, nothing during the day, then the second half in the evening. Supplies came up every few days, usually in convoy, to avoid being intercepted by the British. One even got used to the cold nights. We did not take off our tropical coats and thick non-regulation scarves until well into the morning when the heat had slowly worked through them. This was the thermos principle, which we had learned by observing the Bedouins. But the millions of flies were a real torment. Only when one got deeper into the desert did their number diminish. The heat during the day gradually became unbearable. Everyone sought out a little patch of shade. Some men really did fry eggs on the overheated armor plating of the tanks. It was no fairy tale. I have done it myself. The peak period for the massive downpours of rain was over, but when it did rain, the little wadis were filled in minutes with 3-foot deep flash floods that carried all before them. I once saw how the truck, with our field kitchen, which had failed to get out of the wadi fast enough, was swept along some hundreds of yards by such a wave. On our reconnaissance trips, we sometimes came upon a Bedouin family. Only the Bedouins knew where to dig in order to reach the underground, sweet water lake. In some wadi or other, they would dig out a waterhole, guide the water along hastily dug channels, plant their millet, and stay until they could reap the harvest. The corn would be loaded onto camels, the waterhole filled in, and a day later, every trace would be gone. The Italians managed to locate a few of these waterholes, construct wells, and so use them as vital supply points. Bir Hachaim was one such waterhole. I once managed to make contact with a Bedouin family. They seemed to be on the point of departure. The women ran into the tents at once when we approached. No stranger was permitted to see them. The family sheikh came up to us. We indicated that we were Germans. We did not want to disturb you, still less, drive you away. We regret that we are causing you inconvenience here in your ancestral land. Are not you afraid of the war, of the mines, and so on? In a gibberish mixture of German, Italian, and a few scraps of Arabic, I tried to make myself understood. We always know where you are and move away whenever things get dangerous, replied the sheikh. We have many places where we can find water and cultivate our millet. We are glad to greet you as Germans. We do not like the Italians who have occupied our country, any more than the British, who are oppressing our brothers in Egypt and the other Arab countries. One day, you will all have disappeared again, and the desert will belong to us again. Allah be with you. We like Yoto. It was strange that the Bedouins not only venerated Kaiser Wilhelm II and Bismarck, who were thought by many of them to be still alive, but approved of Hitler's campaign against the Jews because of their own antipathy. We avoided all talk with them about the Jewish question. Suddenly, on the 24th of May 1942, I had been in Africa now for 7 weeks. We were summoned to division. General von Bismarck briefed his commanders. Rommel has decided to attack. Me. British are receiving fresh supplies every day. One can predict when they themselves will start an offensive. Our supplies are coming in too slowly, and they are coming through the harbours of Tripoli and Benghazi instead of through Dima. This means that everything has to be brought up along the one coastal road, a distance of up to 2,000 kilometres. The British may know about our offensive and when it will start, It seems our reports and radio communications are being intercepted, but they do not know where the main thrust will come. Von Bismarck then gave us combat orders and stressed the fact that by means of a vast night march, Rommel planned to move the whole of the Afrika Korps around the south of Bir Hakeim and swing it north so as to cut off Tobruk and thrust eastward to the Egyptian border. A feint attack in the north on the Gazala position was to deceive the British. My Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, acting independently on the right wing, was to advance around Bir Hakeim, giving it a wide berth and block the coastal road east of Tobruk, as well as secure the right flank of the Afrika Korps by means of patrols. We assembled during the night of 26-27 May 1942. It was pitch black. Only the stars of the clear southern sky were to be seen. The exact compass bearings were known to every vehicle. These had to be strictly observed so that the thousands of vehicles travelling through the dark night would not get mixed up. It was a ghostly scene. Each man could just see the vehicle to his front or side. We drove at reduced speed so as to avoid raising too much dust, and thus lose contact with our neighbours. We pushed on slowly through the night. After a while, we knew we were south of Bir Hakeim, though we could not see it. Far to the north we saw the flashes of the Italian artillery R. As we heard later, on the Gazala front, Rommel had sent captured British tanks and trucks fitted with old aircraft engines across the terrain to simulate a tank attack. The attack on the Gazala position was mounted by Italian divisions under a German general. The British did not seem to have spotted us. In the early morning of the 27th of May, my battalion, on the right wing of the 15th Panzer Division, turned north in the direction of Knightsbridge on the Tri Capuzzo, a track parallel to the Via Balbia, which we soon reached. We were in the best of spirits. The surprise appeared to have worked. It was only a few kilometres to the Via Balbia, our objective. It looked as though the British in the Gazala position and in Tobruk were going to be encircled. Toward midday on the 27th of May, I suddenly saw a British tank column approaching from the east. They were new tanks that we had never seen before. Only later did we discover that the tank in question was the American Grant, a tank superior to our Panzer IV. Suddenly, some of the Grants turned south and opened fire on my advanced units from a range that was too great for our 5cc anti-tank guns. I stopped the advance at once and ordered the setting up of a defensive front to the north. To coordinate the use of our defensive weapons, I left my command tank and ran to the anti-tank guns. Shells were bursting all around. I suddenly felt a powerful blow to my right leg and fell at once to the ground. A shell had hit an armoured car, and a piece of shrapnel had cut my upper right thigh. Blood welled out from my trousers. I lost consciousness for some seconds. A scout car came alongside, picked me up, and took me a few hundred yards further back to our doctor. A bad wound. I was angry and in despair. Had my time in North Africa come to an end already? "You are lucky in your bad luck, Major," said the doctor after his examination. "You have got a hole the size of a fist in your right groin. Another few centimetres, and you would have lost your manhood, but no vein or bones or nerves have been hit. Which is just as well, as I would never have been able to apply a tourniquet on the spot. There is no question. You must go to the nearest field dressing station for treatment." That was easier said than done, for in the meantime, the Afrika Korps had obviously encircled the British in the Gazala position, but it had not taken Tobruk. On the contrary, we ourselves were now encircled. To get out of the envelopment from the east was hardly to be thought of. With the help of morphine injections, I managed to resume command in my jeep, for to some extent from pain. "Captain Everth, in case I can do no more, you will take command. I am trying to establish radio contact with Rommel to hear how things stand and what orders are being given." Thank goodness the connection with Rommel went through. The situation was extremely dangerous. At Knightsbridge, southwest of Tobruk, the attack by the Afrika Korps had petered out under fire from the British artillery and the relays of attack by the Royal Air Force. So too had the frontal attack by the Italians in the north. I managed to set up a defensive front to the east. Luckily for us, the British attack from the east was directed more against the two panzer divisions of the Afrika Korps. The British assumed that Rommel would try to break out to the east. That was the basis of their dispositions in the days that followed. Rommel now made one of his rash decisions. He ordered the Afrika Korps to escape from the encirclement, not to the east, but to the west, through the minefields of the Gazala position. My orders were to guard against a breakthrough by the British from the east and prevent a possible outflanking movement in the south. For 5 days I sat in my jeep, still under morphine, until in the morning of the 1st of June, Rommel succeeded with the help of the army engineers in clearing passages through the minefield and in releasing the whole of the Africa Corps from its encirclement, although many vehicles had to be abandoned for lack of fuel. We were the last to disengage from the enemy and reassemble behind the Italian lines. My wound did not look good. I can no longer take responsibility, said our doctor. You must now go to Derna as quickly as possible, to our casualty clearing station. I realized that I could not go on as I was, but hoped that in Derna they would soon get me fit for duty again. With heavy heart, I handed over command to Everth, and close to tears with anger and disappointment, let myself be driven to Derna by good old Manthe and my faithful Beck. An examination by the Germans revealed to my dismay that the wound was not only severe, but that during the 5 days in the jeep, and from the dust of a Ghibli storm, it had become infected. You must go to Germany at once. An Italian hospital ship is in harbour. It will take you to Europe tomorrow. That was the doctor's lapidary verdict. Deeply disappointed, I was carried onto the ship the next day. Adieu, Africa, but not for long. The ship was a large liner, painted white and identified as a hospital ship by a large red cross. I heard later that the ship had been sunk on its way back to Africa, supposedly because it had taken on war materiel. I was put in a little cabin, and there I raged at my fate. The following morning we cast off for Sicily. As my wound was severe, I was one of the first to be taken to the operating theatre, which was run by an Italian surgeon and his team, who, as a nurse told me in a whisper, came from one of the best Italian clinics. The bandages were taken off. The pain grew worse, the more so as I had had no morphine since the day before. We cannot have you becoming addicted, my doctor had said. The Elwabwelhound is not serious, thank goodness. We will clean it up a bit first and go on from there. It was then decided to perform a small operation, and I was told that the limited anesthetics were needed for very severe cases. Clench your teeth, please, I was instructed, short and sharp. While 2 sisters held me tight, the doctor, who seemed to me like a butcher, began to cut away at my wound. I cried out like an animal and thought I would faint with pain. Then I heard a voice. Please stop a moment. Beside me stood General von Verst, commander of the 15th Panzer Division. What's up with you, Luck? Why are you shouting so? I explained the situation to him and asked him to insist on an anesthetic. At his intervention, the doctors agreed, so that the rest of the procedure was bearable. General von Verst told me that he too had been wounded not far from me. General Gauss and Colonel Westphal of Rommel's staff had also been hit. The last he heard from Rommel was that the Africa Corps, after its successful breakthrough to the west, was being marshalled anew to continue the offensive. After my wound had been treated, I sat with von Verst during the short crossing to the mainland. We discussed Rommel's chances of breaking through into Egypt despite inadequate supplies. In Naples, I was examined again and pronounced fit to travel. Next morning, an Italian hospital train bore me north. Although I could not stand, I still enjoyed the journey across the North Italian plain and over the Alps. The sun shone, the countryside looked peaceful, and there was nothing to show that Italy too was at war. Our treatment by the accompanying doctor and nurses was exemplary. After the hardships and battles in the desert, I was overtaken by a pleasant feeling of tranquility. At the Austrian border, we were transferred to a German hospital coach, which was coupled to an ordinary train, and we finally ended up in Esslingen, a small industrial town near Stuttgart. There were now only 3 of us, including a young reserve officer from my own battalion. The municipal infirmary, lying romantically in the hills on the outskirts of the town, had been declared a military hospital. Until we arrived, it had contained wounded from the Eastern Front only. So far, Esslingen had been largely spared by the war, apart from the fact that there too the inhabitants could subsist only by buying food stamps. In addition, there was nothing to be had anymore. It was a good thing I had been able to provide myself with enough coffee and cigarettes before leaving North Africa, for these were more in demand than gold. I now made every effort to get back on my feet as quickly as possible. After a few weeks, I was able to walk on crutches and then, cautiously, with a stick. My mother and sister came to see me from Flensburg. It was an onerous journey right through Germany, since the air raids were continually disrupting rail junctions or causing long delays. My uncle came also from Stuttgart, and we enjoyed the warm sun on the terrace with real coffee and substitute cakes. North Africa seemed far away. All the same, I was glued to the radio every day to hear news from the theatre of war. We had in the hospital just 2 weeks when the special announcement came that Rommel had taken Tobruk on the 21st of June 1942, and that South African General Klopper had surrendered the fortress. Nearly 30,000 prisoners had been captured, and much war material had fallen into German hands, including considerable supplies of fuel, which the Germans needed so urgently. This was followed by the announcement that Rommel had immediately turned east and crossed the Egyptian border on 23 June. Rommel, at the age of 50, was made a field marshal. He commented to his wife that he wished Hitler had given him another division instead. We 3 Africans were naturally the cocks of the walk. When things looked bad on the Russian front, with the encirclement at Stalingrad beginning to loom, Rommel's exploits in North Africa at last offered people a ray of hope again. Nevertheless, they sensed very well that the war would last a long time yet, and result in heavy losses. So Hitler and his propaganda minister Goebbels did not fail to put an undue value on Rommel's exploits, even though they treated our theatre of war in the desert as of only secondary importance. After about 3 weeks I had recovered sufficiently to be able to move about quite well with my stick. Bad Kissingen, my last garrison before the war, was not all that far away. I was able to persuade the medical superintendent to transfer me there until my recovery was complete. I wanted to recuperate in the neighbourhood of my old friends and in the atmosphere of the spa. So one Sunday morning I was taken by ambulance to a clinic that had been requisitioned for convalescent frontline soldiers. As it was Sunday, only one nurse was on duty. She put me in a nice room with a view of the park. "I will bring you some supper right away. I hope you will be comfortable with us. The medical superintendent will see you in the morning." With these words she left me to my fate. There was no telephone in the room. How was I to make contact with my friends? The clinic could not keep me. I found a broomstick and hobbled secretly out of the house to the Huber bar, only a few hundred yards away. When I entered the bar in my faded tropical uniform, it was still early in the evening, and only a few customers were sitting about. Huber looked dumbfounded. "No, it cannot be. Our old friend Luck is here. My God, where have you sprung from? You have been wounded. Make room for our major there. Come to the table of honor." Sepp Huber and his wife could hardly regain their composure. They were so delighted. "Here is my last bottle of whiskey, which I have kept all these years for a special occasion. We will crack it now." The bar slowly filled, and before long I was the center of a large circle and had to give an account of myself. Everything seemed unreal to me. There I sat as in the last year before the war, as though nothing had happened. Toward midnight Huber closed the bar. Only a few customers were left. Then I suddenly realized with a shock that I did not have a key to the clinic. What was to be done? Absence without leave, endangering recovery, etc., passed through my mind. "You can stay with us, Major," said Huber. "As an African veteran you will have no problems here in Kissingen." Then someone knocked on the door. "Let me in, please," came a peremptory voice from outside. It was one of the spa doctors whom I used to know well and with whom I had spent many an evening at Huber's. "I heard you were in Kissingen. Things soon get around here. I came over right away and am very glad to see that you were more or less all right. How long have you been here? What hospital are you in? I am glad to see you too. Let's drink to that." I gave him the name of my clinic and pointing to my broomstick told him how I had got to Huber's. But I have not got a key.